Good afternoon or good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome again to Ideas Festival 2020. Finishing with technical aspects, let me introduce the moderator of the next panel, which is dedicated to what coronavirus means for global economy, Natalija Yareськo. Natalie is chair of Aspen Institute Kyiv. That's for us the most important role, but also Natalie started as Minister of Finance in Ukraine and now serves as Executive Director of Financial Oversea Board in Puerto Rico. And Natalie, the floor is yours. I wish you a productive, effective, and interesting, full of insights conversation. And dear participants, prepare your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yulia. Thanks to Aspen Institute Kyiv and the Impact Hub Odessa for hosting us. Thank you to all those who are participating, and we're thrilled to be here today with you to talk about the global economy in a coronavirus, or hopefully a post-coronavirus world. And joining me today are two outstanding speakers, both of whom you probably know and have heard from before. I'd like to welcome Юрій Городніченко, a native of Ukraine. He is a Quantage Presidential Professor at the Department of Economics at University of California, Berkeley. He received his bachelor's and master's at EERC at the Kyiv Mohila Academy in Kyiv, as well as a PhD at the University of Michigan. A significant part of his research, which is what we'll hear a lot about today, has to do with monetary policy, taxation, economic growth, and business cycles. He serves on many editorial boards, including the Journal of Monetary Economics and Vox Ukraine. He's a prolific researcher, and his work has been published in leading economics journals, cited in discussions and media, and he's received numerous awards for his research. So thank you, Yura, for being here at this early morning in California. And Vladislav Rashkovan joining us. Welcome, Vladislav. Vlad is the Alternative Executive Director at the IMF, representing 15 European countries, including Ukraine, at the IMF Executive Board. Before joining the IMF, Vladislav served as Deputy Governor of the National Bank of Ukraine, responsible for Ukrainian banking sector reform strategy and the turnaround transformation of the central bank itself. Before joining the central bank in 2014, Vladislav spent 8 years in the Unicredit Group. He graduated from the banking faculty of the Odessa State Economics University in 2000, and later was a researcher at the University of Geneva in Italy and the Institute of World Economics of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. So, colleagues, 6 months have passed since the first coronavirus case was identified in Wuhan, China, and the number of new daily COVID infections peaked last week, with more than 177,000 cases being reported globally. Yet, though the virus continues to spread like wildfire, mostly in emerging market economies and in a select number of US states, reopening plans continue. The lack of the consistency in global response has made forecasting the global economic growth quite complicated. There seem to be as many perspectives on the global economy as there are economists, maybe even more than the number of economists. The IMF has reduced its own projections since April to June, whereas the US Congressional Budget Office has actually improved its forecasts from earlier this year with regard to 2021 and the recovery. According to the World Bank, the current recession is the fourth worst since 1871, second only to the declines during the two world wars of the 20th century and the Great Depression. Yet, some governments are claiming a sharp economic recovery is just ahead of us, a V recovery. Others are preparing for a slow, U-shaped recovery at best. And still others are worried and preparing for a worst-case scenario where a second wave of infections hits before year-end, forcing another round of social distancing, economic closures, called a double dip or a W scenario. What does the global economic outlook for 2020 and 2021 look like to you? Vlad, can you help us start out?
Thanks, Natalka, and thanks for inviting and also for the introductory remarks. This panel is about the global economy, and so maybe just to start this discussion and to set the stage, probably I should start with advertising that IMF yesterday published this update for the World Economic Outlook, and the title of which is Uncertain Recovery. And just a few hours ago, the fund also updated the Global Financial Stability Report, which also to be probably read by the participants. And I think these two words, uncertainty from one side and recovery, are very important to understand the global economy in the next years. But to have a picture a little bit more complete, I would add there probably two other words. One is slowdown, and another one is disconnection. And around these four words, I would try to build the comments today, and hopefully to have the discussion with Yura, probably who might not agree with these four words. So I would probably start with the word slow down. And in April, as you already said, Natalka, the IMF forecasted the global economic slowdown, and it was about 3%. And these projections have been already built on the figures which already at that time showed an unprecedented decline in the global activity due to COVID. New data, which we received in the last months, suggest that even deeper downturn for many economies, which would lead to the global slowdown by around 4.9%. These figures which have been announced yesterday. And there is also less optimistic forecast for 2021. And so from what we can take from yesterday's IMF report, and also which could be helpful to discuss, to have a discussion today. The first, we can see the synchronized and simultaneous deep downturn in most of the countries. Advanced economies, emerging markets, and low-income countries. More than 180 countries will be in decline this year, and it makes this crisis unprecedented, as you said in the introductory. For example, during the global financial crisis, or GFC, advanced economies were in recession, but the emerging markets like China, India, South Asia, they were generally growing. Now the first quarter figures of GDP are generally worse than were expected. Maybe a little bit except China, Malaysia, Australia, and high frequency indicators show that the second quarter is much worse. As a result, the decline in the advanced economies, is projected at minus 8% for this year. Minus 8%. This is a big decline for the advanced economies. If to speak countries by countries, and you mentioned the US, US is projected minus 8% as well this year. Japan minus 5.8%, UK minus 10%, Germany around 8%, France 12.5%, and Italy and Spain minus 12.8%. This is a huge decline. And in emerging markets and developing economies, decline is forecasted at the level of 3%. And India, which was yesterday the biggest, one of the biggest drivers of the global economy together with China, is projected to contrast by 4.5%. Latin America as well, Brazil, Mexico, we have minus 10%, and other Latin America countries are minus 12%. All exporters countries, also Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, will be also affected in parallel by the commodity crisis, And it seems only that China, is among the big economies, will show the growth like by 1% this year. But as you understand, this is a huge revision of their forecast. So this is the first big element of the synchronized, downturn. But second part of this, the synchronized goes not only around the countries, but also around the sectors. And because we see the decline both in production industries and also in the service economy, both on the corporate levels and households, both in investments and in consumption. And in consumption is very much important because in all the previous recession, and I'm sure Yuri will tell more about that, the consumers usually use their savings in order to smooth spendings. And now this is not the case. We see due to the lockdown that the consumption went substantially down, and this became a big aggregate demand shock for the global economy. The third big element from the report is the huge decline in the global trade. WTO says, and the UNCTAD expect minus 27% of the global trade in the second quarter. This is unprecedented. And the fourth, and here to finish, that the fourth conclusion is we entered this crisis much less prepared than we did in 2008. I mean, and because probably the world didn't listen to the words of the former IMF director, Christine Lagarde, fix the roof while the sun is shining, because the main central banks, they somehow missed the possibility to, to start raising the key rates in 2013, 2015, to harm the economic growth after the global financial crisis. And as a result, yes, the money became cheaper, the borrowings and debts elevated, but the central banks lost their ammunition to fight the crisis now, and therefore they don't have enough resources to create the sizable economic stimulus. And also as a result of the cheap money, the global debt increased, and therefore limiting the fiscal space for the states in order to act, because the borrowing costs are high and the debt's already high. So all of these factors together, simultaneous deep slowdown along geographies and sectors, and pretty harsh underlying conditions for response policies, they will definitely make this crisis, as Kristina Georgieva said, the crisis like no other. And here I will stop.
Thank you, Vlad. So Yura, do you have a different perspective? Do you see it the same way? What do you project?
Thank you. It's a great honor to join this panel, and I largely agree with everything what Vlad said. It's a perfect storm, and in some ways, when I teach business cycles, I emphasize that business cycles are about synchronization and co-movement. And here we have a perfect example when you have perfect synchronization across countries, across sectors, and in terms of outlook. I guess, one of the most troubling statistics I see in the data is that typically in recessions, we have huge declines in investment, but consumption, especially consumption of non-durable goods, services, doesn't really move that much in recessions. Even in the Great Recession, consumption of services barely changed, it didn't decline. And now we see a massive contraction of consumer spending. And to me, this is the most troubling signal that people have a very dim view of the future. And, this can create problems for us later when we think about the recovery stage. If people don't have optimism, if they don't want to spend, this is going to be a big problem going forward. And finally, I would also like to emphasize that uncertainty is the key word here. Nobody knows what's going to happen next. There is a lot of uncertainty. I would probably say that, in my view, the worst stage of the panic is over. We had days when S&P 500 and other major financial indices were declining by massive numbers, and everybody was, really in a state of terrible panic. That stage subsided, but it doesn't mean we're out of the woods. We're still facing a lot of uncertainty. So stop here.
Thank you. Now, when Vlad said earlier, the estimate right now is that 90% of the countries in the world are suffering from a recession, the highest share in 150 years. I think there's a debate, Vlad, on whether or not some federal central banks and have actually taken and been more prepared. Financial markets seem to be suffering less than in the 2008-2009 financial crisis. There seems to be better regulation in place, and there seem to be some lessons learned about how to try and push money into the economy to improve that consumption spending. But taken all together, Yura, when you look at this situation, you look at what we've learned in the past, what's worked, what it hasn't, and what's happening. What are the key actions that you believe national governments ought to be taking to minimize the downside effects of this recession? What should governments be considering doing, or what are they already doing? What's going to work? What's going to bring us out of this?
Yes, that's a great question. I would say that the Great Recession was a very useful episode for us, in the sense that it really helped us develop the playbook for policymakers. All the unconventional policy tools used by fiscal and monetary authorities, quantitative easing, forward guidance, negative interest rates, active fiscal policy, this was all developed during the Great Recession. And I think it's extremely important that people appreciate that, policymakers cannot sit on their hands and hope that the crisis is going to resolve by itself. And this may seem like, a trivial observation, but if you go back to the Great Recession, and look at the fiscal policy response, it was shocking that in many European countries, the governments basically didn't spend anything to help the economy. And as a result, we had a big recession there, and it was very protracted, very painful. We see all sorts of problems, not only in the economy, but also social issues. And so in this sense, I think it's very useful that this time around, policymakers are a lot more active. They're willing to spend money. Even Germany has a massive fiscal stimulus. So that's very important. We also see a lot of activity from central banks. I agree with Vlad that the space for their actions is much more limited, but it doesn't mean they're completely powerless. One thing I would say is that, we see a lot of action in many governments, but in many countries, we had lots and lots of countries who face a crisis, but we don't see a lot of coordination, and some countries are falling behind. For example, when I look at my home country, Ukraine, I see that the National Bank of Ukraine is very active in fighting the crisis, but the fiscal policy response was, very, very timid, very small, very inconsistent. And so, if we don't try to have a coordinated effort in this, I think it's going to hurt everybody else collectively. I was hoping that the IMF and the World Bank, maybe United Nations, some international organization, or maybe it will be US leadership that will help coordinate this policy response, be more proactive in fiscal spending, more proactive in monetary policy response. But it doesn't seem like this is happening. And I think this is going to be probably one of the mistakes when we look back at this and say, I wish we had, the IMF being a coordinator of all these policy responses, but time will tell.
So without a coordinated response, it's going to be patchy, and it's going to depend on each of the national governments, which are the tools they choose to use in the situation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yura, please.
No, exactly. I just wanted to say that, it's already very clear when we have this patches of quarantines and social distancing. It's especially obvious in the United States, where the response is very decentralized. And instead of one coherent framework, you have all sorts of crazy combinations. And this is going to hurt everybody collectively.
Vlad, tell me, how do you think governments should be acting, reacting? What tools should they be using?
I fully agree with Yura that further coordination and more coordination and more multilateral coordination in order to solve the global problems is needed. But I would slightly disagree that, not many things have been done. I would say massive, many massive actions have been done already, and in an unprecedented short term, both globally, on the level of look at the IMF. IMF in 7 weeks approved 70 emergency finances programs for different countries, for most countries which are needed in order to tackle the health crisis. And this is unprecedented, But if you look at on the local space, there are also many actions have been done, and many of them, believe me, they have been coordinated with the fund. And a few days ago, the investment bank BlackRock, they issued the report, and they said that the global macroeconomic policy has gone through nothing but a revolution, because in a very short period, like in a few months. Because if to compare with the policy response to the global financial crisis, we currently see completely different scale. Not only the response has been faster, but the scale also became greater. Look, how now massively the fiscal deficits or budget deficits are increasing throughout the world. And the IMF, by the way, agrees with that, from the general concept of the fiscal consolidation, including in Ukraine, we're usually going to like 2%, and Natalka knows very well how difficult it to decrease the budget deficit, from the high levels to the very, to low level and sustainable levels. But now in this year, the budget deficit will be, close to 8%. And yesterday we had a briefing about Africa. This is an average budget deficit for this year for most of the African countries, which is a very, maybe unsustainable on longer term. So I would say many things have been done. The central banks, ministries of finance, and health authorities, they acted a lot on the front line for the response of the crisis. Central banks did a lot. They have many novelties in their policies as well, in monetary policies. Many countries, many central banks which did not use before the quantitative easing started using it, and many advanced economies, central banks started, significantly increased their asset purchases in order to give money to the economy, to give liquidity to the economy, and to, and they actually succeeded, which did not bring a substantial increase of borrowing costs, and which also helps the economy to recover. Many central banks open the swap lines, and fiscally, I would say and again, I'm sure that Natalka will understand me very, very well on this. I think one of the major advices to the Ministry of Finance is, yes, take this year seriously, spend wisely, but not make these exceptional costs of this year structural. And especially in the countries where the elections will be in autumn, including Ukraine, I'm waiting for the budget discussion, for the next year, how many politicians would like to keep this cost forward. And I think this is important to observe.
Taken together, what you're saying, though, if there have been a lot of actions and they've been relatively quick, but yet we're still seeing projections that are dire in many, many countries, what should all of our participants be looking at? What kinds of indicators should we be looking at in terms of which way this is going to move? What should we be following? What should people be paying attention to in terms of indicators or actions of governments? Yura?
I would start that with saying that probably the single biggest source of uncertainty is if we're going to have a second wave of COVID infections or not. If we see that infections climb up, we'll see another round of lockdowns. We know they're extremely costly for the economy. And unless we can come up with some more targeted approaches to containing the outbreak, so we don't lock down everybody, maybe we can protect, vulnerable portions of the population, or come up with some other technology to minimize the negative impact on the economy. So I would say, the second wave is the most dangerous. Another that we have to think about the policy response in the following way, I guess. We have a shortfall of income. We have a loss of income. We try to bridge this. But to build the bridge, you have to see the other side of the river, right? If you can't build bridges to nowhere, you can't spend your way out of this, right? You have to have a temporary measure. Otherwise, you have to have structural responses. And so my concern is that, many policymakers will be so concerned that they don't see the other side of the river, that they will have a timid policy response. They will try to tighten monetary policy probably too early, or limit their fiscal response too early. So, that would be another variable for me to keep an eye on. And finally, I guess the general level of pessimism. If people think, okay, this is a new normal, I don't want to spend, the savings rate continues to be at extremely elevated levels, that would be a very bad sign. If we don't see people spending, that's going to be a problem for advanced economies, and then through trade linkages also for emerging economies. So 3 variables: policy response, second wave, and general pessimism of the consumers.
Vlad, do you want to add something?
I fully agree with what Yura just said. Probably I just need to add, few elements on this level, but I would try to a little bit widen the frame, because I think the indicators are important, but I would look a little bit wider. So first we need to look that the fund still projects the recovery in 2021, which is, there are a lot of assumptions, but factually we speak about 5.4% economic growth in 2021, which is already a little bit lower than it was assumed to be in April. And what is also important, that recovery is uneven. So not all countries will go substantially up, some of them go to different direction. And you mentioned in the beginning, Natalka, the issue, if it's we recovery or you recovery, or W. Definitely you don't see in IMF report anything about V recovery. Countries don't expect this. The IMF does not expect it. World Bank does not expect it. I would say even the U recovery goes, or U recovery goes already in the past. So you can find even on the official slide of the IMF that we speak now about, or Nike or swoosh recovery. So which means that virus definitely will be contained one day in future. We don't know when, might take several waves, and many sectors will have longer-term structural damages, which will affect the longer-term trend growth. And I think this is important, but I fully agree with Yura that uncertainty is the major word which we need to look at.
Even with the uncertainty and with the recovery that you're describing, the IMF projects, the World Bank projects, pretty much everyone projects a recovery in 2021. That recovery is still not to the levels of pre-COVID, pre-coronavirus. It is still a weak recovery as compared to what we're losing in 2020. But this is not just a health crisis. It's not just an economic crisis. There's a trade crisis, as you mentioned, Vlad. There's an oil crisis going on. There's a transportation crisis. You look at what's happening to the airline industry. So, Vlad, what sectors of the global trade and economy are most at risk? Who stands to benefit from these changes? What should businesses be doing to reorient, reposition themselves for what the new world will look like as we recover? Excuse me.
I mean, you absolutely correctly. Framed it. In a few, like a month ago, I had a lecture for speech in Deloitte with Deloitte CEO companies, and I used the word the cocktail of risks. So we have a cocktail of risks, which is absolutely correct, and we are still living through the cocktail of risks. And this affects a lot. 2 days ago, I was speaking with a friend of mine, and we were discussing the new normal, as Yura mentioned, and I was saying, what will change? I was asking what will change, because we need to be very clear. The COVID did not, maybe except social distancing, did not start any new trends, but the global trends. But the COVID substantially accelerated other trends. And therefore, we need to understand, just to avoid the paradox of survival that we will have the problem that we will see only on those who survived. We need to understand really who will be most affected. But the second issue is not only who will benefit, not only those who will be affected and who will change, but a friend of mine said, it's important to look what will stay. And this is very important also, not only what will change, but what also will stay. So what will change? And, one of the big factors of the current crisis is definitely the level of mobility, is substantially affected, and it long-term will be affected. So the transport industry will be substantially impacted. I mean, no way, this is already the fact, and this is a global structural damage for the sector. I don't know if Yuri has other opinion, especially air industry. Definitely the energy. Linked to that also the energy for the next few years, it will be a big problem, not only with a risk for the energy crisis, but energy consumption is substantially lower as of today. And definitely banks, because tomorrow these banks who now are supporting the economy with a lot of these lifelines to support the businesses, they will see tomorrow the non-performing loans on their balance sheets. No doubt. And therefore, we will the central banks will have to do this. But what will stay, or what will be benefiting? What industries will be benefiting? It's very clear that the health industry is benefiting. You will see it on the stock markets today already. But definitely the soap. We will wash a lot of hands. Many times. So the soap definitely and the personal hygiene will substantially improve. The food. I think that the demand for food will structurally change, but will be still high. Also, because we will have more population in the world, and because any pandemics can affect it substantially. And there will be a lot of home food, production, and will change a lot of habits, not in favor of restaurants, but more in favor of at-home dining. Everything which will connect with social connection, I think, is very much important in the current circumstances. There was an interesting presentation of EBRD a few months ago. They're projecting that the real estate, and especially commercial real estate, will be substantially negatively affected in the major cities, in the town, in the centers of the cities. But they are projecting the substantial increase of demand for the suburbans, for real estate and suburbans, and development the secondary cities. I would say also the payments industries will substantially benefit, and everything which is online. And the final thing here, if I may ask maybe through other panels and maybe just participants to think, I think we need to work on or think about the words which will stay with us through all this crisis. And one of the words which comes to my mind, and which I also discussed with my friends, is empathy. Everything which will be linked with empathy, because we are really missing the hugs, we are really missing the handshakes. So whatever will help us to keep the empathy even on the distance, I think will benefit in the future.
What about segments of the economy that are so critical, for example, to Ukraine? Migrant work, remittances. How is all of this going to change the future in segments of the economy like that, or other sectors?
It's a great question. I agree with what Vlad said, that usually recessions are reallocation shocks. Somebody is more affected than another sector. Here it's an extreme version where lots of sectors are particularly badly affected, and it's going to have very heterogeneous effects on various countries. For example, Ukraine depends on migrant labor remittances. Right? Is this going to be a problem? Most likely, yes. Preliminary data suggests that remittances are declining. On the other hand, Ukraine had a lot of foreign travel. People went and spent their money in Italy or other countries. This international travel is over, and so in this sense, we have actually an improvement in the current account because of this reason. Also, Ukraine, supplies a lot of food. People will always have demand for food, and so in some ways, Ukraine is going to be a benefactor of this. But it may be also maybe somewhat more unexpected with winners and losers. For example, we were discussing with Vlad that one thing that may happen in this round is that the global chains are going to get a lot shorter. And for example, European Union would like to move production closer to itself, so it doesn't depend on China, for example. And Ukraine, Romania, or similar countries where labor is relatively cheap may be the main benefactors of this kind of trends. Now, I wouldn't say this is going to automatically help Ukraine or Romania or countries like that, because now labor has to fight with robots. Robots became a lot more affordable, more cheap, and as a result, the incentives to relocate production into low-wage countries is going to be reduced. Now, I'll probably have a more positive outlook than Vlad on some sectoral dynamics. I guess, my example is what happened to the airlines after the 9/11. Everybody saw that the air travel is done. There is no way people will want to fly again. It was a massive fear of flying. And it's true, the airlines went through massive contraction. But then within 2 years, there were technological developments. People established metal detectors and other technologies to make air travel safer. And in 2-3 years, airlines completely recovered. And if you look, what happened to airlines just before the great, this recession now, you would never see in the time series that anything like 9/11 had a permanent effect on this industry. So my hope is that, technological improvements will come along, and, we'll have to go back to restaurants, cinemas, we'll have personal touch again, handshakes and hugs. Be a little bit more optimistic there.
Absolutely. I'm going to give you
Natalka,
one more question.
Natalka, may I comment on two small issues here? Yes. Yeah, because I fully agree with Yura on that, and we don't need to forget that the crisis, in many cases, is a big nudge, a big push for the change.
Opportunity. It's an opportunity.
And a big opportunity both for countries, as Yura properly absolutely mentioned, especially when the global value chains will do, the changes, and they will change, and but not only, it's exactly the issue for the technological, for the progress, technological progress, which are inevitable, in this respect. And maybe to come back to the previous discussion on the policies, I think we didn't discuss the labor policies, because the labor policies are crucial, especially for the recovery. for many countries, not only for Ukraine. And linking to the fiscal policies, we will probably need to reallocate some part of the spending to support those who don't have work, to those who might need to maybe relocate to other place from one region to another, in order to in the places where there will be demand for job. And for Ukraine, it's very difficult because Ukraine is not so mobile inside of the country. And probably we'll need also to stimulate some kind of retrainings and upskilling and reskilling of employees of the enterprises. And this could be the good government spendings and investments for the future of Ukraine.
Of course. And I'm going to finish with my last question. I'm asking all participants to send in any questions you have so we have time to answer them. But before we go to your questions, the last question for both of you, either of you. So you've all mentioned policy solutions that have been used previously, maybe are being used today. Are there any lessons learned? Do you have any examples of countries that you think have done it well to date, managed the crisis well? Maybe New Zealand is an example. Or have you seen any countries that have managed it poorly? And I'm talking less about the healthcare response than the economic policy response. Do you have any examples of success or failed policies that we ought to be watching and reflecting on as we move forward? Either of you? No one?
I would say Germany, I agree with some island nations did very well in terms of containing the pandemic and minimizing the fallout in terms of the economy, like New Zealand and Australia. But, they're very special in many ways. You can seal the borders and limit travel. So in this sense, they're very unique. You have to look at countries where, you're connected to the rest of the world by land or by other means of transportation, which people can use easily. I would say Germany is probably surprisingly, in some case, in some sense, it would be, a country doing surprisingly well. They're willing to spend, they contained the outbreak, they had a lot of support from the ECB, and so it worked out pretty well. In terms of, poor responses, unfortunately, there are many, many, many examples. Brazil would be one, where you see like a total meltdown in terms of the economy, healthcare, and I guess every statistic. And unfortunately, there are many countries like this.
Vlad?
I agree with Yura. It's even not interesting what you agree with everything, what you say, because it's very complimentary what I would love to say, Yura said. Probably I would add here maybe two elements. One is, I used in the beginning the word disconnection, and this disconnection, what I would mean is, we are discussing now pretty, not so bright picture anyway, for at least for 2020, 2021, it's not so bright. And I fully agree that even by end of 2021, we will not reach the level of end of 2019. But, we have a global slowdown, global trade slowdown, decrease of the consumption, decrease of the production, different industries. But when you look at the US stock market, the stock prices return back to the January. And this is a complete disconnection, with a real economy and the capital markets. And this disconnection is a big vulnerability for the US economy, And I think this is we need to to have this in mind. And in respect of the country support, as an IMF, I cannot maybe say praise or not praise other countries, but what I would look is, and yesterday we had a call with Darren Ajumoglu, still the institutions play a huge role. If we have the credible institutions with credible policies to which people trust, these countries actually go in the right direction and they tackle this crisis and definitely will come up as winners. In the countries with institutions where people don't trust, the lockdown will be complicated and the second wave will be complicated, and therefore this is crucial, I think.
All right, we're going to move to the questions that you've been sending us. We have a lot of them, and I'm going to go from the general to the specific. I'll try, and you don't have to both answer each question. You just feel free to jump in if you would like to speak to the specific topic. So from Facebook, I'm curious if the COVID crisis has offset the trends that were supposed to bring about the next economic crisis in the world. We know that crises are cyclical, and there are certain economic indicators that the next crisis is coming. And there were many discussions about the one to come before COVID, and then the pandemic came and changed all the trends. Could it be that COVID has now eliminated those other trends and those other cyclical crises, and they're going to be eliminated? So we've only replaced one for the other?
Maybe I can start. You know, one thing with business cycles is that you never know what is going to be a problem and when it's going to happen. Like, nobody knew the Great Recession is going to happen. Nobody knew that 91 recession is going to happen, that oil crisis is going to happen. And so in this sense, COVID is no exception. It was a total unexpected force, and in some sense, we're very unprepared. Now, I should also say that, you know, there is little evidence that crises depend on how long an economy has been in an expansion. So, you know, you can have an expansion for 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. It doesn't mean that as you spend more time in an expansion stage, you are bound to have a crisis. You have many examples where countries didn't have recessions for many, many, many years. I guess one famous example is Australia, which didn't have recessions since early 90s. And, you know, China didn't have recessions. I mean, China is a special case, but, you know, it didn't have recessions really. It didn't have a contraction of input. So in this sense, I don't think, you know, COVID is unusual, but I agree that, you know, probably some imbalances were building up, and COVID just, you know, exposed them, made them, you know, laid them bare. So in this sense, it's true. In terms of long-term trends, you know, nobody knows. In the long run, we're all dead. But I would say, you know, there is basically like an iron law of economic growth in the United States. If you look at the last 200 years and look at the rate at which GDP per capita grew, it was 2% over many, many, many decades. And I have a hard time thinking, you know, what is different now relative to what we had in the previous 200 years. And why we shouldn't have 2% growth again in the future. We had pandemics, we had world wars, we had all sorts of crises. Nonetheless, the economy rebounded and we kind of continue to grow 2%. Now, US is unusual in some sense because it didn't have wars for many years on its soil. But I think that's an example that we can have prosperity in the long run, and we shouldn't think that COVID is going to be the end of it.
Thank you. Here's another one from Facebook. Were the quarantine limitations even worth introducing, given the economic downslide?
I think it's the answer for this is complicated, and still we need to look for this in future. You know, what the 20th and 21st century shows us, but we need to trust the professionals. We need to trust those who have an expertise, not always to politicians. And the professionals in these specific areas say that social distancing was a must in order to substantially reduce the development of the crisis. And they still say that the crisis is, I mean, the medical risk is pretty high and it's pretty deadly. And in order to flatten the curve, we had to go to lockdowns. And for sure, these lockdowns affected the global economy and affected the local economies, absolutely. And here, as I said before, the institutions should have played and the institutions should have responded properly. And definitely this response was uneven, just because different countries, they have different levels of capacity to respond to this. And maybe to add one word to what Yura said on the previous question, I would add the word fragility. You know, those countries who are fragile, who have many weaknesses, have been affected and will be affected much more in the long term than those who have stable institutions and more healthy economies.
I'm going to combine two questions here related for you. One is, one of our participants says that, quote, I may predict that the movement, I think this is in Ukraine, will go from being a country sourcing wood, food production and IT to outsourcing and technology, from IT outsourcing and technology to the next level, like our own production. And that this will happen because of supply chain changes that Yura was mentioning earlier, they're going to be post-COVID. And I'll unite that with the question, which skills will be required after the corona crisis? Is this an opportunity for innovation and the IT sector in Ukraine? In other words, is this going to change the nature of the Ukrainian economy?
Well, this is a different question because I mean the answer to the previous question, you know, if it's a driver for change, yes, for sure, it's driver for change. Is it a driver for increasing demand for IT? Absolutely, no doubt. Will Ukraine benefit from this? For sure, you know, because Ukraine is one of the, I mean, strong players on the global arena of the, at least of the outsourcing services. Maybe not so much on the production, you know, own production of.
But the question, Vlad, is whether we can move beyond outsourcing. Can we move to the next stage is the question. Because of the supply chain changes, because of what's happened in this virus, is that going to stimulate a significant move to the next level of value add production, whether it's in IT, whether it's in food or other?
I think there were many nudges, many pushes to impact it already in the past. And I think there is even a group in Kyiv which has been working on this, how to create the different, so how to add the missing puzzles to the Ukrainian IT ecosystems, which is not only the education, I mean, it's also including like marketing. You know, you need to not only really to do outsourcing, you need to do a lot of more, including development of the capital market, the development of the venture capitalism in the country. All of these are important elements. And I do hope that COVID will make another nudge for that, you know, but as I said, the nudge was supposed to be there already for years.
Yuri, did you want to add something on the changes that you had expected, the opportunities that you see for the Ukrainian economy?
I agree with Vlad. You know, Ukraine is a land of opportunity. We had so many opportunities in the past and they were squandered. And I sincerely, I guess I'm mixing my forecast and my hope that,
Right.
You know, this time will be different and we'll make a qualitative transition from being an outsourced country to a production country.
Yeah.
All right, next question from our participants. Given the changes that you forecast, which skills will be required by people after the corona crisis? We talked about workforce development. We talked about investing into skills. The question is, which skills do you think are going to be most critical post-corona?
You know, being able to use Zoom is going to be very important. But, you know, I guess in general, what is great about the education system in the US is that it teaches you general skills and you can transfer them from one occupation to another. Unfortunately, in Ukraine, education system is more kind of focused on a very narrow set of skills. And given this in certain environments, it's hard to, you know, believe that one set of skills is going to help you in the longer run. So I would say, you know, flexibility, transferability of skills across, you know, various occupations or jobs is going to be a key for success.
Yeah, I think it's a question for another
group,
another big panel. You
okay.
know, it's a big issue. You know, and you know, I think we just need to again. There is nothing, the trends are there, you know, the trends are there. And I think one of the trends, and I agree with Yuri about the transferability, but in Ukraine, the education is an ended process. So you finish the university and you end learning, you know, factually. And I think what is the major thing we need to think, you know, globally in the long term, is that it's a lifelong exercise. You know, we need to continue learning, you know, being even in the older ages.
So we have two more questions before we close quickly. It seems that our economy is based on consumption. This COVID crisis has made us purchase less, spend less on entertainment. Instead of going to the shopping mall, we now go to the forest. How should the structure of our economic system change so that we don't depend on just buying more things? Consumerism, consumer spending.
It's a good question.
Yeah, I would say consumer spending is going to be with us forever. Consumers will have to spend. What they will spend on it will be different. social, as Vlad said earlier, social distancing is going to be the norm many months to come, maybe many years to come. And so in this sense, some sectors are going to be adversely affected. But, as the question suggested, there is a bright spot in that. Like, people should exercise more, spend more time outdoors. That's a great opportunity to improve health and the economy at the same time.
All right, last question for you both. Quick answers. What is your advice for the Ukrainian government, Ukrainian citizens in this situation? What are the key challenges for policymakers in Ukraine? Narrow it down to Ukraine for our participants.
My one advice is to try to be and to remain the island of adequacy in the world, and to be, maybe not to remain, and because this will be much demanded, in the new normal, in the global, decline in general. And second is to be a reliable partner for those for whom we are partners, because we need to keep our obligations, contractual obligations, including for corporate, and therefore any protectionism measures, they're not helping. When you're limiting imports or limiting exports, it's not helping to the global economy and also to Ukraine. And the third is, as I said before, the institutions. Institutions is a must. We really need to increase the credibility of the institutions, because this is something where people should look at when there is a crisis. They need to rely on something. They need to rely on the state. And if they cannot rely on the state, if the state start questioning, do we have someone who can protect us? This is a very dangerous and existential question, which we don't want them to ask.
Yura?
I agree with everything Vlad said just now and before, especially that we really need to rely on professionals. We can't have random operations and chaotic responses. We have to have professionals sit down, work out a consistent strategy and stick to it. We don't want to have defaults or anything like this. It would be a disaster.
Thank you very much. I want to take this moment to thank our guests today, Yura and Vlad, for sharing their insights, their perspective. I think if you just take away some of the key words from today and think them through, coordination, optimism, consumption, institutional quality, empathy, flexibility. I think that we have learned a great deal today, and I urge the rest of the community of our viewers to stay online today. Join us later for sessions on climate crisis in perspective, on leadership. And then tomorrow, join us as we focus on Ukraine, and Saturday on the individual, all in times of crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Yuri. Thank you, Vladislav, for a fantastic, very dynamic panel discussion. Not that optimistic, but realistic, and you showed different perspectives. I think it was very valuable for our viewers, participants. We received a lot of other questions online. We will try to follow up with them. But thank you so much, Natалія Яресько, Vlad Rashkovan, and Юрій Городніченко, for being with us with this panel. And I highly appreciate all our participants join our next two sessions, which will start in 4 minutes. Thank you, and have a good day, those in that part of the world.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.